A pilot cuffed a Navy SEAL into the jump seat and lashed him with rope. Seconds later, the SEAL snapped the restraints back around the pilot's throat, and what happened next will leave you speechless. He bound a father and his son with cuffs and rope, laughing as they struggled to breathe. Subscribe if you believe no cruelty against the innocent should ever. The cockpit door remained open longer than it should have. Commander Elias Vance noticed it the moment he stepped into the narrow cabin of Flight 417, his boots landing with quiet finality on the carpeted floor. The air was chilled, the recycled breeze carrying the faint scent of coffee and something sterile. But it wasn't the smell or the chill that made Elias pause. It was the eyes, the captain's eyes. From behind the half-open cockpit door, Captain Marcus Lorne stared directly at him. Not a glance, not a courteous nod. A fixed, unmoving glare, like a man sizing up an opponent he already hated. The pilot's features were sharp, sun-creased in a way that suggested years in command, but his gaze burned with something personal. It wasn't standard protocol, and it wasn't subtle. Elias said nothing. His body stilled, but only for a moment. With a steady hand, he guided his twin sons down the aisle. 16-year-old Caleb moved first, brushing a hand along the headrest for balance. Ryan followed, nodding politely to a flight attendant who flinched when the cockpit door finally slammed shut behind them with an aggressive click. "Did you see that?" Ryan whispered, just loud enough for his father to hear. "I did," Elias replied, calm as ever. His voice was quiet, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. "Keep moving." They took their seats near the rear of the business-class cabin, adjacent to the emergency exit. Elias always chose strategic positioning. The corner of his mind never stopped calculating routes, angles, possibilities. Old habits didn't die. They evolved. Caleb leaned back with a soft sigh, adjusting the strap of his duffel. Ryan stared out the window, jaw set, fingers drumming lightly on his armrest. "Was that the captain?" Caleb asked, voice low. Elias didn't answer immediately. He watched the crew move about, 2 male attendants preparing the cabin, exchanging glances that weren't casual. Their smiles didn't reach their eyes. The tension was thin but present, like a string pulled just tight enough to hum if plucked. Elias finally nodded. Yes, Captain Marcus Lorne. He didn't mention the name had sounded familiar when announced at the gate. He wasn't the type to chase ghosts, but something about it had settled uneasily in his chest. As the engines roared and the plane taxied down the runway, Elias closed his eyes briefly. The memorial they had just attended lingered in his thoughts, faces etched in granite, names engraved into cold stone. Men he had served with, men who never came home. His sons had stood beside him during the ceremony, silent and proud. They didn't fully understand, not yet, but they respected it. That was enough. The aircraft lifted off with a smooth lurch, and Brantwell City fell away beneath the clouds. The hum of flight filled the cabin. Elias opened his eyes and reached into his carry-on, pulling out a worn tablet. A photo of his old unit glowed on the screen. 8 men in desert camo, dust-covered and grinning in front of a battered Humvee. A different time, a different world. Overhead, the intercom crackled. "Good evening, passengers," came the voice of Captain Lorne. It was steady, even cheerful, but beneath the tone, Elias heard something else, something performative. "This is your captain speaking. We're cruising at 36,000 feet. Skies are clear. Should be a smooth flight, unless we've got any tough passengers on board who think they run the place. You know who you are?" The intercom clicked off. A few passengers chuckled awkwardly, unsure whether it was a joke or some kind of inside comment. Elias didn't smile. He felt Caleb shift beside him, his brow furrowing. "Was that about us?" Ryan asked, leaning closer. Elias didn't answer. He tapped the tablet off and slipped it into the seat pocket. His back remained straight, shoulders squared. He had heard the mockery, loud and clear. He just chose not to rise to it. Not yet. Further up the aisle, one of the flight attendants leaned over and whispered something into the other's ear. They both turned and glanced toward Elias's row, quickly looking away when they realized he was watching. Elias's fingers curled slightly against his leg. He had seen looks like that before, on docks, in briefing rooms, in places where tension ran deep under polished smiles. Something was off, and it wasn't just Marcus Lorne's attitude. The cockpit door opened again for a moment, then closed with a thud. The atmosphere shifted subtly. Elias turned to Caleb and Ryan. Eyes open, ears sharp. If anything feels off, tell me. Got it, Caleb replied instantly. Ryan nodded, more hesitant. Is this about what the pilot said? It might be. Or it might be nothing. But we treat it like it matters. For the next hour, nothing happened, outwardly. Drinks were served. The seatbelt sign dimmed. A child laughed somewhere behind them. But the unease stayed. Marcus Lorne's voice didn't return, but his presence loomed in the silence. Then came the whisper. As one of the attendants passed by to collect trash, Elias caught it, barely. A murmur into the intercom handset. He's watching them again. I don't like this. The voice wasn't meant for passengers, but Elias's hearing was trained to catch fragments others missed. The final clue arrived when the cockpit door opened a third time. Marcus stepped halfway into the cabin, just enough to scan the rows. His gaze locked onto Elias again, but this time he didn't look away. Military families think they own the skies, Marcus said, just loud enough to be heard by those nearby. A few heads turned. One man raised his brows in confusion. No one laughed. Elias didn't move, didn't flinch, but his jaw clenched once. Marcus returned to the cockpit without another word. The door slammed behind him, harder than before. The quiet that followed was heavy. Caleb looked at his father. You're not going to say anything? I don't need to yet. But he's targeting us, Ryan added. That wasn't random. I know, Elias replied. His voice was calm, but something colder moved beneath it. And I want to see how far he's willing to go. The twins fell silent, each now gripping their armrests. The hum of the aircraft continued, but it no longer felt steady. The calm was too still, the quiet too sharp. Elias sat back and exhaled slowly. He thought about the lives he'd saved, the men he'd buried, the battles he'd fought. He didn't believe in ghosts, but Marcus Lorne was clearly haunted by one, and he had brought that ghost into the air with them. There was no protocol for this, no mission briefing, but Elias knew one truth better than anyone. He thought discipline was his shield. Soon it would be his weapon. The intercom crackled with static, drawing passengers' attention. Then came the captain's voice, calm but edged with something sharper. Ladies and gentlemen, looks like we've got a few strong personalities on board today. Hopefully, our military guests can manage without taking over the cockpit, he said, letting out a dry chuckle that fizzled awkwardly across the cabin. A few passengers laughed politely, uncertain whether it was a joke or not. Most returned to their reading or screens. But in row 7A, Elias Vance didn't flinch. His eyes stayed fixed on the glowing tablet in his lap, a faded digital photo of his old SEAL unit under the sun-bleached Afghan sky. He tapped the screen softly, pausing on one face. A name, a memory, a mission that had nearly cost them everything. He barely heard the announcement, but 2 rows behind, Caleb Vance did. Seated near the rear galley, the teenager had risen slightly to stretch his legs when he caught the low hum of voices from the partially ajar cockpit door. He leaned back, careful not to draw attention, and listened. He thinks he's some kind of hero, Captain Marcus Lorne whispered harshly to the co-pilot, Adrian Cray. Let's see how heroes handle humiliation. There was a pause, then Adrian's shaky voice. Marcus, this isn't necessary. Follow the orders, Marcus snapped, or I'll ground your wings before we touch down. Caleb's brows furrowed. His gut twisted. He sat upright and looked toward his father across the aisle. Elias remained unreadable, posture still, shoulders square. But something in his eyes flickered, like a man waiting for thunder from a cloudless sky. The seatbelt sign dinged overhead. A soft chime, followed by Marcus's voice again. "Folks, we've hit a patch of turbulence. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain seated. Flight crew, prepare the cabin." But the skies beyond the windows were clear. Not a tremor, not a cloud in sight. A few passengers exchanged puzzled glances. The aisle rustled as a male flight attendant approached, eyes deliberately avoiding Elias's. His name tag read, R. Montclair. His voice was practiced, but the nervousness showed at the edges. "Sir," he said, clearing his throat, "the captain requests you and your sons move to the forward jump seats for safety." Elias turned to face him fully. "That's not standard turbulence protocol," he said evenly. Montclair hesitated, glancing back toward the cockpit as if the walls themselves were listening. "I was told to inform you directly, sir." Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his seat beside his father. Caleb had already started moving up the aisle, but his pace had slowed. Elias studied the attendant's posture, the rigid stance, the twitching fingers at his side. He made a decision. "Let's go," Elias said quietly to his sons. "Keep your eyes open." The walk forward felt longer than it was. Elias's boots moved with measured precision, each step a reminder of discipline forged under fire. Caleb's eyes darted across the cabin. Ryan walked a pace behind, tense and silent. As they reached the bulkhead before the cockpit, the flight attendant stopped and stepped aside. The cockpit door slid open. Captain Marcus Lorne stood just beyond it, framed by the narrow corridor, a crooked smile on his lips. In one hand, he held a pair of metal handcuffs. In the other, a coil of thick military-grade rope. Elias's jaw tightened. Marcus's tone was low, mocking. "Let's see if a SEAL knows how to sit still." Metal clinked sharply as the cold cuffs bit into Elias Vance's wrists. "Secure them for inspection," Marcus Lorne barked, his voice tight with malice. The words echoed like a command on a battlefield. But this wasn't a war zone. It was a cockpit sealed from the world, transformed into a twisted stage of humiliation. Adrian Cray, the co-pilot, hesitated, his eyes darting nervously between the captain and the family he was being ordered to restrain. The young man's hands trembled as he reached for the cuffs, his face pale beneath the overhead cockpit lights. Caleb Vance jerked his arm back instinctively. "Don't touch me," he said, his voice edged with confusion and rising anger. Without warning, Marcus shoved him back hard against the wall. The impact knocked the breath out of the teenager's lungs, and before he could recover, Adrian slipped the cuffs on, avoiding eye contact. Elias's jaw tensed as he watched, but he didn't move, not yet. Ryan was next. His voice cracked. "Dad," he whispered. Elias turned his head just slightly, eyes steady. "Stay still. Observe everything." The father's calm tone masked the fire building beneath the surface. He wasn't just observing, he was calculating. Every breath he took was measured. Every angle, every knot in the rope that was now looped across his chest and arms, every flicker in Marcus's expression, he absorbed it all like a soldier scanning the battlefield. "Nice and tight," Marcus muttered, yanking the final knot around Caleb's chest with cruel satisfaction. "You soldiers think you're untouchable." "Not up here." His breath smelled of stale coffee and spite. He paced before them like a predator finally trapping his prey, eyes lit with the hunger of years-long resentment. The cockpit door slid closed with a soft, mechanical thud. Outside, the hum of the engines and the muffled chatter of the unaware passengers carried on as if nothing had happened. But inside the cockpit, the air was heavier, saturated with threat. Marcus crouched before Elias, eye level, lips curled in a bitter sneer. "You don't remember me, do you?" Elias didn't blink. "Should I?" Marcus's eyes twitched. His voice dropped to a poisonous whisper. "My brother was a pilot." Name was Travis Lorne. He flew support for SEALs during a mission in Kandahar, a mission your unit botched. Elias's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. He remembered the mission. The terrain had been unforgiving, the intelligence faulty. 3 aircraft were shot down during extraction. There had been casualties, too many, but no one was blamed directly, not officially. He was discharged, Marcus continued, standing and pacing again. Spiraled after that. Said command threw him away. He died in a motel room 4 years ago. Alone. I'm sorry to hear that, Elias said evenly. Sorry? Marcus spun around, furious. You ruined him. You people and your medals and your silence. And now they call you heroes. What about my brother? No one answered. Adrian sat stiffly in the co-pilot's seat, knuckles white on the armrest. His foot tapped anxiously beneath the console. He was scared, but also conflicted. Elias could see it in his posture, the way he shifted his gaze whenever Marcus's back was turned. The captain stepped forward again, his shadow casting over Caleb. You look just like him, he said, his tone suddenly mocking. Your father. All confidence. Bet you think he can get you out of anything. Without warning, Marcus backhanded Caleb across the face. The crack of impact echoed like a gunshot in the tight space. Caleb recoiled, head snapping sideways, cheek blooming red from the blow. Ryan flinched in horror. Elias's body jerked forward only to be yanked back by the restraints. Don't touch my son, Elias said, voice low and controlled but heavy with warning. Marcus leaned in, inches from Elias's face. What are you going to do about it? Huh? You're strapped like an animal. Elias's jaw clenched, his breathing slowed. You've already made your mistake, he said. Oh? Marcus chuckled, backing away. And what mistake is that? You think control is power, Elias said quietly, but real power, real strength, is knowing when not to strike. Big words for a man tied to a seat. Marcus returned to his pacing, unaware that Elias had subtly shifted his shoulders with each movement, adjusting pressure against the ropes, testing resistance. He felt one knot near his shoulder loosening with every breath he took. Not much, but enough. Adrian stood up abruptly. Captain, he said, voice trembling, this isn't right. We should, Marcus turned, eyes wild. You fly the plane. I run the flight. Adrian hesitated, his lips parted as if to argue, but the fire behind Marcus's eyes shut him down. He sat back down, face flushed with shame. Elias studied the man carefully. Marcus was unraveling, his voice louder now, his pacing erratic. Each word revealed not a man in control, but a man desperate to justify his cruelty with pain from the past. Ryan's voice broke the tension. Dad, are we going to be okay? Elias looked at his sons. Caleb's lip was bleeding slightly, but he held his head high. Ryan looked shaken but alert. Elias gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Yes, he said softly, but we wait. Not out of fear, out of purpose. Above them, the overhead light flickered just once. Marcus returned to the front, arms crossed, watching his captives like a warden savoring his dominion. He didn't see Elias's slow exhale or the subtle twist of his wrists. The knot binding his right arm gave slightly, millimeters at best, but it was a start. Behind his still eyes, Elias Vance prepared. He remembered the training. Resistance under duress, escape under restraint. Marcus had used standard restraint methods, clearly copied from airline manuals, but Elias had broken worse in the dark belly of foreign prisons. Rope was rope. Pain was pain. But timing was everything. His pulse slowed deliberately. He inhaled again, deeper, letting the rope press against his chest, and then exhaled fully, letting his body shrink just enough for the fibers to slide. The knot slipped again. Caleb glanced toward him, catching the movement. Their eyes met. A silent message passed between them. Wait. Soon. And when the time came, Marcus would regret believing that submission meant surrender. Restraint is not weakness. It's the storm waiting to strike. Marcus's grip tightened on the knotted rope, his face flushed with cruel satisfaction as he pulled once more, drawing the bindings tighter around Caleb and Ryan's chests. The cords bit into their ribs, forcing the air from their lungs in short, wheezing gasps. Caleb tried to adjust his shoulders to relieve the pressure, but Marcus yanked harder, his knuckles pale from force. "You command men?" "Let's see you command me," he sneered, his breath hot and close to Elias's face. Elias Vance, still bound to the jump seat beside his sons, didn't move. His jaw clenched, but his eyes remained steady, unflinching. Rage simmered just beneath the surface, but he buried it deep. Now wasn't the time. He catalogued every detail, the angle of the knot against his son's clavicle, the sound of Marcus's boots scuffing the cockpit floor, the way the rope fibers creaked when stretched too tight. "Captain, this isn't right." Adrian Cray's voice broke through the tense silence, thin and uncertain. The co-pilot stood near the cockpit threshold, one hand half raised as if unsure whether to advance or retreat. His pale face gleamed with sweat, and his gaze flicked nervously between the restrained family and the furious pilot. "You're flying under my authority," Marcus barked, snapping toward him like a whip. "Sit down." Adrian hesitated, his body frozen mid-step. He obeyed, slinking back to the first officer's seat with his eyes cast downward. The moment his weight sank into the cushion, Marcus turned toward the control yoke and tilted it ever so slightly. The aircraft responded with a lurch, a deliberate nudge that rocked the entire fuselage. Above the cabin, overhead bins rattled violently. Passengers murmured in growing unease. A baby began to cry. Oxygen masks trembled in their compartments, some threatening to fall. In the galley, a flight attendant staggered and caught herself against the cart, trying to maintain her composure as trays clattered behind her. Elias absorbed every movement. He could feel his son's shallow breathing, hear the shift in the plane's rhythm, and sense the tightening spiral of chaos Marcus was cultivating. "Just turbulence," Marcus said mockingly, casting a glance over his shoulder as if daring Elias to question him. "Best keep the military nice and still." Elias shifted in his seat so subtly that no untrained eye would notice. He expanded his ribcage slowly, then exhaled in a long, steady breath. The ropes across his chest loosened by a fraction, just enough for movement. Years of combat training returned to him like muscle memory. He tested the angle of his elbow, flexed his shoulder blades, and identified the weak points in the knot structure. These weren't military restraints, they were sloppily done, meant more for humiliation than security. "Dad," Ryan whispered, barely audible over the hum of the engines. Elias didn't answer. He kept his eyes on Adrian, whose gaze briefly met his before darting away. The co-pilot's hand twitched near the throttle, but fear held him in place. Elias understood. The younger man had never faced this kind of pressure, certainly never with a madman at the helm and lives hanging in the balance. Marcus continued to pace, feeding on the silence. He walked behind the jump seats, tugging the ropes every few steps just to hear the twins grunt. Then he stopped and leaned close to Elias's ear. "I could leave you like this," he whispered. "Imagine the headlines. Commander tied down during emergency landing. Can't even save his own sons." Elias turned his head slightly, meeting the pilot's sneer with a calm, unreadable stare. "You've already written the headline, Marcus. Just make sure you're proud of it." Marcus stepped back, eyes flashing. "I'll be remembered." You'll just be another uniform in a chair." The pilot returned to the controls, fiddling with the autopilot settings again. The aircraft responded with a brief drop in altitude, followed by a sudden rise that made stomachs lurch and cabin lights flicker. In the rear of the cockpit, Elias shifted again, this time adjusting his knee. The knot across his thighs began to slacken. Caleb, still bound beside him, glanced over, his face pale but determined. He saw his father's movements, subtle as they were, and nodded imperceptibly. Ryan's hands, though tied, flexed against the armrest. Their hearts pounded, but none of them panicked. They waited. Above them, the emergency speaker clicked faintly. Adrian had opened the intercom, perhaps hoping someone in the cabin could hear, or perhaps as a silent cry for help. Either way, it told Elias one thing. The co-pilot hadn't given up. Marcus returned to the jump seats, breathing heavily. He crouched beside Caleb and gave the ropes another unnecessary tug. "You look just like your father," he sneered, his voice low and venomous. "Weak behind the uniform." Caleb winced, but his gaze remained defiant. Elias's eyes sharpened. That was the trigger. That was the misstep. He inhaled deeply, pressing his back hard into the seat. His shoulder blades flared. The rope slid fractionally across his uniform. As Marcus turned his attention to Ryan, Elias twisted his wrists outward, just enough to push the knot along the sweat-slicked skin. The binding shifted. He looked once at Adrian, who watched with wide, anxious eyes. Elias didn't speak. He didn't blink. But his message was clear. Wait. Not yet. Almost. And so he endured it. The pilot's taunts, the twins' suffering, the slight ache in his chest as he waited for the exact right moment to strike. In silence, vengeance learns the shape of patience. "You look just like your father, weak behind the uniform." The words slithered from Marcus Lorne's mouth like venom, his face inches from Caleb's, breath hot and sharp with malice. His eyes gleamed with twisted satisfaction, feeding off the fear he hoped to see. But Caleb didn't flinch. Instead, his eyes flicked sideways, just briefly, locking with his father's across the cramped space. No words passed between them. None were needed. Years of discipline, drills, and silent understanding had forged a bond stronger than blood. That single glance was a signal, a call to rise. Elias Vance inhaled, a slow, deliberate breath that filled his chest with as much air as the rope would allow. His ribs expanded against the pressure, the fibers groaning in resistance. He knew rope, knew its weave, its friction points, its weaknesses. The coarse strands scraped his skin, digging deep into scarred flesh that had endured far worse. He held the breath for a heartbeat longer, feeling the fibers strain, and then twisted. Snap. The sound was small, almost lost beneath the constant hum of the aircraft systems. But to Elias, it was a battle cry. His right arm broke free first. The slack from the unraveling loop gave him the angle he needed. He shifted his weight forward, not recklessly, but with purpose, driving his shoulder into Marcus's torso with a force that sent the pilot stumbling backward into the cockpit door. A sharp grunt escaped Marcus as his back slammed against the panel, his smirk vanishing in an instant. Adrian Cray jolted from his seat, his voice cracking through the cockpit speakers. "Captain down!" The alarm in his tone wasn't scripted, it was instinctive, a reflex drilled from years of protocol. Passengers likely heard it without context, but inside the cockpit, it sounded like the opening bell of a war. Marcus staggered, one hand reaching blindly toward the emergency baton mounted beside his seat. His other arm flailed for balance, knocking against switches and levers that could have turned catastrophe into chaos. Elias didn't wait. He surged forward, tearing the remainder of the rope off his torso, skin burning where it resisted. His left wrist was still cuffed to the seat, but he dragged it forward with sheer force, metal scraping across the armrest with a scream of protest. Caleb moved next. He didn't shout, didn't panic. He reached instinctively for the cuffs hanging loose from the armrest. The steel was cold in his hands, but his grip was steady. His heart pounded with adrenaline, but his mind was clear. Every word his father had ever spoken about control and composure rushed back now, guiding his every move. Ryan yanked the restraint strap from the wall hook with a snap. The nylon hissed as it slid through his fingers, ready to be used. The tide had turned in seconds. Marcus fumbled with the baton, fingers closing around the handle just as Elias's boot came down hard on his wrist. A crack echoed in the confined space, not of bone, but of resistance breaking. The baton skidded across the floor and disappeared under a console. "You tied my sons," Elias said, voice low and steady, the calm before a storm. He gripped Marcus's collar and dragged him fully into the jump seat area, planting a knee into his spine to keep him down. "Now, feel what you built," Marcus growled, trying to twist free, but the fight was gone from his limbs. He was outmatched, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered. Caleb stepped forward, hands shaking only slightly as he secured the cuffs around Marcus's wrists. Click, then click again, tighter this time. Ryan wrapped the restraint strap around Marcus's upper arms, looping it through the jump seat frame for added security. The once dominant figure now slumped, powerless and gagging on the silence that followed. Adrian stared, eyes wide. What do we do now?" Elias rose slowly, his breathing heavy but controlled. "Now we hold the line," he replied, never taking his eyes off Marcus. For a moment, the cockpit was still. The hum of the engines returned as the backdrop, steady and unnerving. Outside the sealed door, passengers sat in oblivious tension, unaware that the balance of their survival had just shifted. Elias flexed his hands, blood returning in prickling waves as the circulation came back. His gaze hardened, but not with rage, with resolve. This wasn't over. Marcus had acted with calculation, not impulse, and men like him rarely placed all their malice in one act. Still, for now, Elias had regained control. Justice often begins where cruelty thought it ended. Marcus thrashed violently, his boots scraping against the cockpit floor as Elias Vance pressed the cuffs tighter around the pilot's wrists. "You'll ruin us all," Marcus gasped, his voice strained with fury and panic. He jerked sideways, trying to twist free, but Elias didn't flinch. His hands moved with the steady force of someone who had tied knots in the dark with blood on his gloves and silence pressing against his ears. Each motion was clean, precise, not driven by anger, but by discipline. He didn't need rage. Control was enough. Ryan, eyes wide but focused, crouched beside the jump seat, already unwinding the emergency restraint rope from its sealing clasp. The fibers unwound with a soft hiss, like a fuse burning. "Dad, headrest secure," he called out. Elias nodded once. Caleb knelt on the opposite side, steadying Marcus's thrashing legs. Though his hands trembled slightly, adrenaline honed his reflexes. His grip didn't falter. The three of them moved like a unit, a single organism trained for the unpredictable. Elias looped the rope through the metal support bars of the seat, yanked it tight, then tied it off in a high-tension hitch, cutting off Marcus's wild kicks. Adrian Cray stood frozen near the console, eyes darting between the restrained captain and the blinking flight indicators. Sweat beaded at his brow as he watched the man he'd once followed become a prisoner in his own domain. "I never thought. I didn't know it would go this far," Adrian stammered, the words spilling out in a whisper. "You knew enough," Elias said, his voice level. "You didn't stop him, but you can still help fix this." Marcus let out a bitter laugh, head tilted back against the headrest. "You think you've won?" he sneered. His voice was low now, almost calm. Too calm. "You don't even know what's coming." The words dropped like ice water into the cockpit. Everyone paused. Something in his tone, mocking, sure, didn't fit a man who'd just been overpowered. It was the sound of a trap that hadn't been fully triggered yet. A sharp ping echoed across the instrument panel. Red warning lights flared. Adrian's eyes widened. "The autopilot. It's been disengaged." "What?" Caleb spun toward the console where the steady green light had turned an angry red. The entire plane pitched downward, subtle at first, then faster. Passengers in the cabin began to murmur in confusion. Luggage jostled in the overhead bins. The quiet hum of controlled flight was now underscored by the unsettling moan of shifting pressure. Elias lunged toward the controls. "Stabilize pitch." Right now, Adrian scrambled into the pilot's seat, fingers flying across the buttons. Altitude falling. He changed the flight mode, manual override is locked, Marcus wasn't done. Even bound, he jerked his knees forward and kicked hard behind him, slamming his heel into a control lever below the console. Crack. The metal arm snapped clean off, flinging backward and striking the wall. The cockpit jolted with a violent lurch. Elias grabbed the panel to steady himself. The plane shuddered as if resisting the air itself. Alarms began blaring. Altitude drop, trajectory error, hydraulic strain. Elias turned back to Marcus, eyes burning. "What did you do?" he demanded, grabbing the pilot's collar and dragging his head back. Marcus didn't answer. He just smiled through the pain, his lips split and dry. The kind of smile a man wears when the fire is already lit behind the curtain. Adrian's voice cut through the chaos. "Pitch trim is locked out. Manual input not responding. We've lost stabilization." Caleb braced himself against the wall. "He set this up in advance," he said. "All of it." Elias didn't speak. He stared at Marcus, studying his face. The man had been broken physically, but his mind was still at war, still playing a longer game. Elias could feel it. The battle wasn't over. Not by force, by design. "Ryan," Elias barked, "brace the co-pilot's chair." "Caleb, keep your eyes on the panel." "Adrian, breathe slower. You're flying like the horizon depends on it, because it does." Adrian took a long, shaky breath, trying to suppress the rising panic in his chest. His hands steadied on the throttle. "I've got it," he muttered. But Marcus wasn't finished. He turned his head slightly and hissed out a final jab, the gag around his mouth barely muffling the words. "You land this thing, and it burns." Elias didn't blink. He pulled the restraint rope tighter around Marcus's shoulders, jerking the man upright again. "You just made your last mistake," he said, his voice like steel cooling in ice. "Sometimes victory demands more than strength. It demands control over chaos." Alarms wailed as the cockpit pitched forward, jolting hard enough to send loose papers fluttering like panicked birds. Elias Vance didn't flinch. He surged toward the console, one hand gripping the back of Adrian Cray's seat, the other steadying himself against the overhead panel. "Trim up, stabilize altitude, ignore him, focus on the horizon," Elias ordered, his voice sharp but controlled. Adrian's fingers fumbled across the switches, knuckles pale with strain. "Yes, sir," he replied, barely above a whisper. Sweat beaded along his hairline, and his foot pressed the rudder with uneven pressure as the plane's nose slowly began to lift. Behind them, Marcus Lorne, bound at the wrists and ankles, thrashed violently against his restraints. His voice rose in a manic pitch, slinging insults, laughter, and nonsense like shrapnel. The sound cut through the tension like static, loud and jarring. Elias spun, snatched a length of the restraint rope still hanging loose, and wrapped it tightly around Marcus's mouth, knotting it at the back of his head. The pilot gurgled a protest, his words now muffled beneath the gag. "No more words," Elias muttered, his jaw clenched. In the main cabin, chaos had begun to bloom. Overhead compartments rattled, and oxygen masks had deployed, dangling like ghostly pendulums above screaming passengers. Children cried. Someone shouted in the back. The flight attendants were overwhelmed, their faces pale and stiff as they tried to corral fear with soft reassurances. Elias knew that if the panic spread, it could lead to injuries, or worse. But the cockpit came first. Contain the threat. Then steady the crowd. Ryan, crouched just behind the cockpit bulkhead, crawled forward and pulled open the secondary comms panel beneath the pilot's seat. His hands moved quickly, fingers prying at the plastic casing until he found the switch. With a flick, the crew intercom buzzed to life. He held the receiver out to his father. Elias grabbed it and spoke, his voice a calm force that cut through the noise. "This is Commander Vance," he said into the mic, each word crisp, measured. "Remain calm." The situation is under control." His tone was like an anchor, steadying those who could hear it. In the cabin, attendants paused, catching their breath. Several passengers leaned toward the speakers overhead, hearing something solid amid the chaos. Adrian glanced up from the panel, his face a mix of relief and rising dread. "They heard you," he said, "but we've got another problem. We're locked out of ground communications. I tried 3 different channels. Nothing's going out." Elias's eyes narrowed. "Marcus is doing?" Adrian nodded. "He must have overridden the encryption port." "We're flying blind." Elias turned to the co-pilot fully now, his voice low and firm. "Can you bypass his lockout?" "It'll take time." "Then make time." Adrian nodded, already pulling wires from beneath the dashboard, searching for the manual relay port. Sparks crackled faintly as he yanked the comm switch from its socket and began rewiring it using the emergency tools tucked in the cockpit's armrest panel. Caleb, standing by the jump seat, didn't relax. His eyes hadn't left Marcus for the past several minutes. The pilot had stopped thrashing, but something in his stillness felt wrong. Calculated. Intentional. Then he saw it. "Dad," Caleb said quietly, stepping closer. "Look at his cuff." Elias turned, following his son's gaze. There, nearly hidden beneath the folds of the binding strap, was a glint of metal. A tiny silver pin, no longer than a paperclip, resting just against Marcus's wrist. "That's not part of the restraint," Caleb continued, voice tight. "It's something else." Marcus's hand twitched again, and for a brief second, his eyes met Elias's, gleaming with something too calm to be fear. Elias dropped to one knee, gripping the man's arm and pulling it outward to inspect the pin. His gut twisted as he spotted the faint red diode blinking softly beside it. "He planted something," Elias whispered. "What is it?" Adrian asked, turning slightly. "Not sure. But it's no tracker." Elias's voice turned cold. "It's a trigger." Adrian's face went pale. "You think it's tied to something on the plane?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He studied the blinking diode, tracing the line of Marcus's cuff to the possible circuit junction. Then he saw it, an embedded microchip near the wrist hinge, thin wires running under the fabric like veins. "I've seen this before," Elias said, gripping the restraint tighter. "Modified remote trigger. Could be wired to the electrical or the fuel lines Ryan moved to the other side of the cockpit. If he activates it, could it?" "Yes," Elias cut in, "and we wouldn't even know what until it was too late." He grabbed a flight pen from the instrument panel and used it to pry open the cuff's casing. Inside, a tangle of microcircuits blinked back at him. Elias pulled a stripped wire from the disabled comm panel, then unhooked the wire casing using the edge of his broken watch. With a breath, he pressed the copper end against the base of the circuit and grounded it to the metal seat bracket. A spark snapped, hot and loud. Marcus jerked. The diode went dark. Elias held the wire in place for another beat, waiting. No fire, no alarm. Just silence and the soft hum of the stabilizers returning to their normal rhythm. Marcus froze, the confidence draining from his eyes. His mouth moved behind the gag, but no sound escaped. The threat had been neutralized. "What did you do?" Adrian asked, blinking at the now disabled device. "Disarmed his ego," Elias said. The room was still. The hum of electronics and the soft hiss of the ventilation system were the only sounds now. Caleb stared at the extinguished diode. "How did you know what to do?" Elias looked at him, the years of war and wisdom carved deep into his voice. "Because I've seen men like him. They never stop at threats. They always build them." And then the final line came, low and steady, as Elias's eyes returned to Marcus. "In calm water, danger often hides beneath the surface." The pilot tied the SEAL's twin boys into the jump seat, mocking them, saying they deserved to be restrained, before striking them in rage. "If you believe every abuse of power must be answered, hit subscribe now. Justice starts here." "Don't move." Elias's voice cut through the tense silence like a blade. His hand shot forward, seizing Marcus's arm and yanking it upward, forcing the bound pilot's wrist into the light. The others froze, Adrian clutching the flight yoke with pale knuckles, Caleb standing stiff with his back against the panel, Ryan halfway through stepping forward. All eyes locked on the faint, blinking red diode nestled at the base of Marcus's restraint. It was no ordinary cuff. For a split second, no one breathed. Elias's gaze sharpened, locking in on the tiny light pulsing with malicious rhythm. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple as realization gripped him. This wasn't just a threat of violence. It was a mechanism, a trigger. And Marcus's slow, smug grin beneath the gag confirmed it. "You think you can control this?" Marcus mumbled through the cloth, the words distorted but unmistakably cruel. Elias narrowed his eyes, ignoring the taunt. He turned the cuff, careful but urgent, examining the steel band that had bound them just moments ago. And there it was, barely visible beneath the hinge. Thin wires, a sliver of circuit board, and a recessed red diode blinking like a ticking heartbeat. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. A detonator, or worse, a signal device, wired to something in the cockpit system, possibly even the electrical grid of the plane itself. "He's linked this to something in the console," Adrian whispered, leaning forward, his face tight with dread. I've never seen this tech before." Ryan's voice broke from behind, fearful but steady. "If it detonates—" "It won't," Elias snapped. His tone was sharp but not panicked. Instead, it was controlled, measured like a man climbing out of a burning hole 1 inch at a time. His training took over, pushing emotions to the back of his mind. He'd dismantled pressure mines under gunfire. He'd cut bomb wires while bleeding from his shoulder. This was a different battlefield, but the enemy was the same, a ticking decision wrapped in metal and pride. From his shirt pocket, Elias drew a slim flight pen, its metal shaft catching the cockpit light. He turned to the console, yanked a communication line loose with a swift twist, and stripped one wire end with his teeth. The copper strand unraveled, delicate and shining. He bent low beside Marcus's arm, steadying it with one hand while threading the wire through the restraint joint with the other. "Dad," Caleb whispered, unable to look away. Elias didn't answer. His eyes never left the diode. His breath slowed. The circuit was closed, he could see that now. All it needed was motion, pressure. A tilt of Marcus's wrist and the surge would pulse into the console. That meant disarming the live line while grounded. No room for error. He slipped the flight pen beneath the cuff and angled it toward the exposed microchip, letting the tip graze the circuit line. Then, with careful pressure, he laid the copper strand across the contacts, creating a new path. A bypass, a silent kill switch. He grounded it through the pen casing. Electricity surged. A tiny spark popped, burning his knuckles. The diode blinked one final time and went dark. Everyone froze. No explosion, no flicker, no shockwave. Just silence, broken only by the quiet mechanical hum of the stabilizers realigning in the background. Marcus's body tensed, then sagged in defeat. His jaw tightened against the gag, but the mocking grin had vanished. His eyes, once brimming with hatred, now looked hollow. "What did you do?" he growled, muffled and bitter. Elias stood slowly, his face calm but resolute. He looked down at Marcus like a man observing the collapse of a long, threatened wall. "I disarmed your ego," he said quietly. Behind him, the cockpit lights blinked steady. The danger was paused, but not gone. The air still felt thick, like the storm hadn't finished forming. Caleb stared at his father with wide eyes, caught between fear and awe. He took a hesitant step closer, glancing at the deactivated cuff, then back to Elias. "How did you know what to do?" he asked softly. Elias turned to his son, locking eyes. His voice didn't waver. "Because I've seen men like him. They never stop at threats. they always build them. Sometimes the fight isn't against a man, but against what he's built inside himself. Static burst through the cockpit speakers just as Elias Vance tightened the rope binding around Marcus Lorne's wrists. The hiss of white noise crackled for a tense second before a clipped voice emerged from the control tower, thick with urgency. Flight 417, respond. We've detected erratic altitude changes. Identify immediately. Elias didn't hesitate. He leaned forward, his voice calm and measured, the cadence of a man used to commanding chaos. Control, this is Commander Elias Vance. Captain Marcus Lorne attempted sabotage and assault. He's restrained. Co-pilot Adrian Cray is maintaining flight. Silence. Then a pause that stretched a beat too long. When the reply came, it was laced with disbelief. Commander Vance, confirm. Are you military personnel? Retired SEAL, Elias said, sharper now. Authorization code 9X-Ray-14. We require priority landing clearance. The control tower's tone shifted instantly. Gone was the doubt, replaced by focused urgency. Understood. Proceeding with emergency protocol. Maintain current heading and prepare for descent on runway 12 Bravo. Elias exhaled, barely a breath before turning toward Adrian. The young co-pilot's hands trembled as they hovered over the controls, but he nodded. Starting descent procedures, Adrian said quietly. Behind them, Marcus sat hunched and bound, his uniform wrinkled, sweat gleaming on his brow. His eyes, bloodshot and restless, flicked from control panels to Elias's back. The smile that curved his lips was not of defeat, it was of unfinished war. Then it happened. With a sudden convulsion, Marcus jerked his bound legs forward and twisted violently, slamming the side of his foot into a recessed panel beneath the console. A metallic click echoed in the cramped space, followed by a sudden whir and a sharp, alarming chime. The cockpit dimmed. Lights flickered. "What did he do?" Adrian shouted, already scrambling to steady the yoke. A high-pitched alarm erupted, and across the control panel, a red light blared. Fuel, starvation. Valve, shut. Elias spun around, eyes narrowing at Marcus. The man grinned behind the gag still tied across his mouth, his chest heaving with quiet triumph. "What did you engage?" Elias demanded, his voice low but pulsing with restrained fury. Marcus made a strangled noise behind the gag, half laugh, half growl, and then nodded slowly toward the floor. His eyes glistened with malevolence as he tilted his head just enough for Elias to read his lips. "You land this plane," he mouthed, "and it burns on touch." The metal hatch beneath the cockpit floor groaned as Elias forced it open with the tip of his elbow. The crawlspace yawning below was barely wider than his shoulders, a cramped shaft of bundled wiring, cold steel panels, and decades-old dust. Without a word, he dropped to his knees and slid into the darkness, boots scraping metal, joints tensed from years of forgotten missions rising again in his muscles like instinct. Above him, Caleb knelt with a flashlight trembling in his hand, the narrow beam slicing through the gloom. "Dad, are you okay?" he called out, his voice cracked with fear. "Keep your focus up there," Elias replied sharply, the command in his voice steady and undeniable. The crawl tunnel vibrated with every motion of the aircraft. Turbulence rolled through the fuselage like an angry wave, and the walls around him trembled with the groan of flexing bolts. Elias pressed forward, dragging his body inch by inch through the corridor of wires. Sweat formed fast on his brow despite the cold metal against his arms. His mind burned through the schematic of a plane he had studied years ago, remembering where the override system sat, buried behind 2 reinforced panels and 1 locking circuit board. Halfway through, he paused. The faint scent of ozone and burned insulation stung his nostrils. Elias followed it, eyes narrowing until his gloved fingers found the fuse cluster. The casing was warped, blackened, sabotaged. He bit down on a growl of frustration. "He burned the relay," Elias muttered into the dark. Behind the charred panel, a network of melted connectors sputtered with weak current. The override for the emergency fuel valve had been rigged to fail, intentionally destroyed so the flow would choke mid-descent. If they didn't fix it, the engines would starve the moment they hit final approach. Elias reached for his watch, unfastening it with tight, methodical hands. The strap was thin steel, titanium-coated, gift from a fellow operator years ago, and strong enough to handle current without snapping. He unhooked the buckle and bent it into a makeshift bridge, then stripped an auxiliary wire from the panel's side and twisted its frayed ends around the connector. Sparks crackled. His fingers twitched involuntarily as current bit through the steel into his skin. The pain was sharp, but he held firm. A hiss of electricity passed through the improvised circuit. Above, a shout. "Fuel restored!" Adrian's voice rang out from the cockpit, full of disbelief and relief. Elias exhaled. He didn't smile. There was no time. He slid backward, each inch a slow retreat from the steel beast's throat. His shirt clung to his back, soaked with sweat. When he emerged, Caleb dropped to his knees beside him, grabbing his shoulder. "You did it," Caleb whispered, awe and fear in equal measure on his face. Elias gave a curt nod and stood. The dim cockpit lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the control panel. He walked forward, toward the bound figure slumped in the jump seat. Marcus Lorne's eyes tracked his every move. The pilot's face twisted into a smirk, but the hatred behind it remained raw and unhidden. "You really think you've beaten me?" he sneered, voice hoarse behind cracked lips. Elias stared at him for a long moment, then stepped close. Inches apart, he lowered his voice, calm and final. "I didn't come to beat you," he said, breath steady, eyes cold. "I came to end this." Without hesitation, Elias unhooked the same rope Marcus had used on his sons, the one that had cut into Caleb's ribs and left Ryan gasping for breath. He didn't waste time with ceremony. With sharp precision, he looped it around the neck restraint bar behind Marcus, pulling it tight and secure, a sailor's knot cinched with brutal elegance. Marcus flinched, his composure cracking for the first time. The restraint clicked into place. The rope no longer symbolized weakness. Now it was justice. Elias stepped back, eyes never leaving the pilot. Every storm meets its calm, just never on the side that started it. The descent began. The aircraft dipped gently, but the tension inside the cockpit was anything but smooth. The low hum of engines was overshadowed by the steady beeping of altitude indicators and the muted gasps of passengers beyond the sealed door. The glow from the control panels painted everyone in harsh blue and amber light, like ghosts navigating the edge of disaster. Adrian Cray sat rigid in the co-pilot seat, knuckles white as he gripped the yoke. His breathing was uneven, shallow, and fast. Sweat trickled down his temple, mixing with the fatigue and panic that clung to every inch of him. His fingers hovered just above the throttle, trembling slightly. The radio crackled with static, then came the calm voice of air traffic control. "Flight 417, emergency runway cleared. Fire and medical teams standing by. Do you copy?" I copy," Adrian stammered, then swallowed hard. "We're initiating final descent." Behind him, Commander Elias Vance stood like a sentry, legs slightly apart, arms loosely at his sides. His eyes, cold and laser-focused, were locked onto the glowing horizon line just beyond the cockpit glass. The golden edge of dawn touched the clouds in the distance, but it did nothing to soften his expression. His body was steady, but inside, the weight of the past hour pressed down on him like armor. At his feet, Marcus Lorne writhed in defiance. The once commanding pilot, now a restrained prisoner, was bound tight against the jump seat frame with thick rope and steel cuffs. His lips were cracked around the gag, a damp cloth looped tightly to silence his taunts. But that didn't stop his body from twisting, thrashing, kicking uselessly against the metal under him. "You think this makes you righteous?" he muttered from behind the gag, his voice hoarse and wet, muffled but venomous. Elias didn't answer. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he scanned the instruments, cross-checked the altitude, and leaned slightly toward Adrian. "Speed steady," he said, his voice low and clear. "Maintain flaps at 15 until we're under 1,000 feet." Adrian nodded quickly, grateful for the guidance. "Yes, sir." In the back of the plane, Caleb and Ryan moved through the cabin like silent shadows, their youthful faces pale but controlled. They spoke softly to frightened passengers, offering brief words of comfort as overhead lights flickered back to life. One of the attendants looked at Ryan with tears in her eyes, mouthing a thank you. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Ryan returned to the cockpit doorway, where he leaned in and whispered, "Cabin's holding together." Nobody knows the full story, but they know something went wrong. "Good," Elias said without looking away from the console. "Let's keep it that way until we land." Outside, the runway stretched like a thin gray blade through the haze. The wheels began their slow descent, landing gear humming into place. The aircraft trembled slightly as turbulence tugged at its wings. Suddenly, Marcus began thrashing violently, his boots slamming against the floor, his entire body convulsing in a desperate final act. His bound feet twisted, trying to hook onto anything, pedals, wires, even Adrian's legs. He growled behind the gag, wild-eyed and red-faced, veins bulging in his neck as he bucked against the restraints. Elias didn't hesitate. In one swift step, he crouched low, wrapped his hand around the rope binding Marcus's chest, and yanked it tight. The pilot's head slammed back against the jump seat with a dull thud. "Stay still," Elias growled, his voice like a blade in the dark, "or we all die." The plane pitched slightly, a subtle warning from the wind outside, but Adrian recovered quickly, guiding the nose with practiced care. "Final approach," he whispered, barely loud enough to hear. The ground rushed toward them. The wheels struck the tarmac with a screech that ripped through the silence. The fuselage shuddered. For a moment, the entire aircraft shook like a leaf in a storm. Once, twice before leveling out into a long, sliding stop. Outside, red lights and flashing beacons from emergency vehicles blurred past the windows. Then, stillness. The hum of the engines faded. The landing gear moaned as the weight settled. Inside the cabin, someone let out a sob, then another, and another. It was as if the plane itself exhaled, releasing every ounce of tension it had held since takeoff. Cheers broke out, passengers clapped, others cried openly. A few embraced each other, shaking, overwhelmed by the sheer relief of being alive. But Elias didn't move. He stood still as stone, hand still gripping the restraint rope, knuckles pale, eyes unreadable. Marcus had gone limp, his breathing shallow, the fight drained from his limbs. Elias leaned close to him, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some men break rules to save lives. You broke them to destroy one." His gaze didn't soften. "And now the sky itself has judged you." The shriek of metal being pried apart echoed through the narrow fuselage as emergency crews forced the cockpit door open. Inside, the scene brought them to an immediate standstill. The air was thick with tension and the faint sting of sweat and adrenaline. Captain Marcus Lorne sat slumped in the jump seat, his wrists bound tightly behind him with the very cuffs he had once used to restrain others. Rope ran across his chest like a crude harness, looped and cinched around the seat's steel bars. A shallow gash above his right brow oozed a thin trickle of blood, now drying against his temple. His eyes, wide, bloodshot and unfocused, stared at nothing, filled with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Behind him stood Elias Vance. The retired Navy SEAL's posture was upright, though his shoulders sagged with exhaustion. His hands were raised slowly and deliberately, fingers spread to show he was unarmed, his breath calm despite the raw red marks circling his wrists. His dark shirt clung to his frame, soaked with sweat and the effort of everything that had unfolded above the clouds. "I'm Commander Elias Vance," he said evenly, voice low but steady. "The threat is neutralized. Everyone is safe." Two paramedics exchanged quick glances, one stepping forward while the other whispered into a handheld radio. The moment held stillness, as if the entire cockpit were pausing to decide whether to exhale. Then, behind Elias, movement. Caleb and Ryan were being helped through the forward cabin door by uniformed responders, their faces pale but composed. Caleb looked over his shoulder, locking eyes with his father for a brief second, one filled with silent understanding and something deeper. Pride. Ryan, limping slightly from earlier impact, followed, still gripping the broken restraint strap in one hand as if refusing to let go of what had been done to them. Just beyond the jet bridge, a wall of federal agents and airport security personnel waited with tense, focused eyes. Their attention shifted instantly as Adrian Cray stumbled out of the cockpit behind the twins, his flight uniform crumpled and streaked with engine oil. His hands trembled, but his voice was clear. "It's true," Adrian announced. "The captain assaulted passengers, tried to sabotage the flight. Commander Vance took control when no one else could. He saved us." The confirmation hit like a hammer. Officers stepped into the plane, pushing past stunned passengers who had been evacuated toward the terminal. Some had glimpsed the pilot's madness. Others had only heard rumors whispered down the aisle during the chaotic descent. But now, faces turned, phones raised, capturing the moment that had already begun to spread like wildfire across news networks and social media. Elias lowered his hands as two federal agents approached. One of them, Agent Granger, an older man with a crisp voice and graying temples, stepped forward and extended a hand instead of reaching for his cuffs. "We've reviewed the audio. We've seen the footage. You're not under arrest, Commander," he said, eyeing Marcus coldly. "We're here for him." A stretch of silence followed. Marcus, still bound and bleeding, looked up with something between a snarl and a plea. But no words came. His jaw flexed beneath the gag, his nostrils flared with fury. Yet the power was gone. The cockpit no longer belonged to him. Later, in the airport's medical ward, the atmosphere shifted. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Elias sat on the examination table, sleeves rolled up and hands outstretched. A medic gently disinfected the rope burns and lacerations, wrapping them in gauze. Across the hall, Caleb and Ryan were undergoing routine checks. Their voices echoed faintly, a mix of protest and laughter as they fumbled through the process. Elias heard Ryan complain about the stethoscope being cold and Caleb asking whether he'd get a scar on his cheek. He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. The television mounted in the corner of the room flickered with a news anchor's voice. A banner scrolled across the bottom. "Retired SEAL subdues rogue pilot mid-flight." A blurred image of the aircraft's descent was followed by aerial shots of emergency vehicles on the tarmac. The world was already crafting its narrative, one filled with drama, courage, and relief. But Elias didn't feel like a hero. Federal agents later briefed him on Marcus Lorne's past. They spoke in clipped, factual tones. Marcus's younger brother, once a decorated military transport pilot, had been dishonorably discharged after a classified SEAL extraction mission fell apart, one led, unknowingly, by Elias's former unit. The pilot had spiraled after the scandal. Marcus had taken the fallout personally, his mind warping grief into obsession. "He blamed your unit for his brother's ruin," one of the agents said. "He spent years studying aircraft layouts, plotting military-heavy routes." Your name appeared in his files more than a dozen times inside Marcus's apartment. They found blueprints, maps with red lines circling specific flights, audio recordings full of vitriol, pages torn from military manuals, annotated in angry scrawl, and a list of targets. Elias's name was near the top. He listened to all of it in silence. Back in the quiet corner of the medical ward, Elias rested his hands on his knees, feeling the sting beneath the fresh bandages. The pain was dull but persistent, his breathing slow, almost meditative. An orderly stepped in, holding a clipboard. "You're free to go, Commander." "Your sons are waiting just outside." Elias didn't rise. Not right away. He looked down at his palms, bruised, calloused, and shaking slightly. So many battles fought, so many victories claimed. But tonight felt different. There had been no celebration in his heart, no thrill of triumph, just the heavy weight of having survived again. His voice, when it came, was soft, measured, almost lost in the sterile air. "Discipline saved us," he murmured. "But peace costs more." And then, as if the weight of the world had decided to rest upon his shoulders, he added, "And sometimes, survival feels heavier than battle." The plane had landed. The cuffs had been removed. The cameras had stopped flashing. But inside Elias Vance's mind, the memory played on an endless loop, like turbulence that refused to settle. Each night he saw Caleb's face twisted in pain, the rope biting into his shoulders. He heard Ryan's shallow breaths, felt the violent jolt of the plane lurching in midair, and relived the pressure of metal biting into his own wrists. Even in sleep, the images stalked him like shadows just behind the door. Victory, they called it. Headlines praised him. Awards were mailed to his home. Adrian Cray's commendation ceremony was televised. Marcus Lorne had been sentenced to life without parole. The world had moved on, but Elias hadn't. He spent hours pacing the perimeter of his quiet home, hands behind his back, body upright, posture trained by decades of discipline. But his eyes betrayed the rest. They drifted too often, fixed on nothing, hunting for threats that weren't there. He never spoke about it, not even to his sons. But they knew. Caleb had started martial arts 3 weeks after the incident. He trained with relentless intensity, early mornings, late evenings, bruises on his arms that he never explained. The boy's movements sharpened each day, and though he rarely smiled, there was a fire behind his eyes, one that hadn't been there before that flight. Ryan, quieter but no less determined, applied to the cadet aviation program at Haversfield Base. He passed the written exams effortlessly, aced the simulations, and began training with a focus that made instructors raise their brows. "Why aviation?" one had asked him. Ryan had looked out the hangar window before replying, "Because the sky should feel safe again." The instructor had no reply. Now, on a clear fall morning, Elias stood at the edge of the training field at Haversfield Airfield. The roar of practice jets echoed across the tarmac as young cadets jogged drills between cone-marked lines. The wind was crisp and dry, cutting through his jacket, but he didn't flinch. His boots were planted shoulder-width apart, and his hands were folded behind him, steady, unshaken. From the control tower, the voice of a trainer crackled over the intercom. "Cadet, Flight Group 2, maintain bearing and altitude. Recenter on the beacon." 2 jets banked in unison, their shadows dancing over the asphalt. A low rustle broke Elias's focus. Footsteps approached, quick, hesitant. A voice followed. "Commander Vance." He turned slightly, recognizing the man immediately. Young, maybe in his late 20s, press badge swinging from his neck. The kind of face you'd expect at a college paper rather than national news. But his eyes were determined. "I'm Daniel from the National Aviation Post," the journalist said. "I know you've avoided interviews, but if I could just get one quote, just one, for the article. Your story's inspired a lot of people." Elias exhaled through his nose, eyes drifting back toward the cadets. He didn't speak. Daniel pressed on, sensing an opening. "They're calling it the most heroic civilian intervention in aviation history. You saved over 100 lives. Your sons, what they went through. It changed how people view passenger safety protocols, training standards, even psychological screening for pilots. You've rewritten the rulebook." Still, Elias remained silent. A plane rose from the far end of the field, its engine soft and distant. He watched it climb, the silver body glinting against the morning sun. The reporter lowered his voice. "What message would you give to those who look up to you now? The ones reading about you, the young cadets behind us, your sons." Elias turned then, fully, the wind tugging slightly at the collar of his coat. His jaw was firm, but his gaze was thoughtful, measured. "Strength isn't in the fist," he said quietly, voice calm and resolute. "It's in restraint, the kind that breaks only when justice demands it." Daniel froze, pen halfway to page, struck by the stillness of the moment. Elias turned back to the airfield. A jet rose from the runway like a silver arrow, splitting the clouds as it climbed toward the open blue. For a moment it glowed, brilliant, untouchable, and he smiled. Somewhere above, a plane cut through the clouds, steady and bright. He smiled faintly, imagining his sons up there one day, rewriting what the sky meant for their family. Because even the stormiest skies can be reclaimed by those brave enough to rise again. He thought ropes made him powerful. Seconds later, those same restraints wrapped around his throat. If you stand for dignity, justice, and accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of abuse of authority, retaliation, and the dangerous consequences of humiliating those who have been trained for combat. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire accountability, empathy, and nonviolent solutions to abuse of power.